Turns out Jefferson's declaration resulted in years of violent struggle with the British, but more important, it exposed a weak American government. So this Constitution was supposed to define it and solidify it, but before it was set in stone, there had to be a series of compromises. Number 1, the Great Compromise. This one created the House and the Senate, 2 senators per state, House of Representatives based on population. The bigger the population, the more representatives each state could have to fight for its interests. This causes issues, specifically between southern states and northern states, because they aren't sure how to count slaves. Which leads us to number 2, the 3/5 Compromise. The South wanted to play both sides of the fence. On one hand, they didn't want to count slaves as people, but instead wanted to count them as property, because the greater the population, the more taxes you have to pay. But, on the other hand, they needed more population, because the greater the population, the more representation they got. And with more representation came more power. And the North was like, nope, slaves can't be human, because the North didn't have as many slaves, and therefore couldn't risk letting the South have more power. So the compromise was to create a fraction. Every 5 slaves equaled 3 humans. So just to do the math, that's like saying if there were 15 slaves in one room, on paper, they counted as only 9 people. This 3/5 of a man equation worked for both the assimilationists and the segregationists because it fit right into the argument that slaves were both human and subhuman, which they both agreed on. For the assimilationists, the 3/5 rule allowed them to argue that someday slaves might be able to achieve 5/5, wholeness, whiteness, one day. And for segregationists, it proved that slaves were mathematically wretched. Segregationists and assimilationists may have had different intentions, but both of them agreed that Black people were inferior. And that agreement, that shared bond, allowed slavery and racist ideas to be permanently stamped into the founding document of America.